I moved in for the light. It was the practical kind of light, the thin, indifferent wash that spread across the kitchen tile at 7 in the morning, the way it filled the living room window and made the dust motes look like confetti. After the breakup, after the arguments that stretched into weathered mornings and then into empty afternoons, I told myself I needed a place with a window that insisted on being honest. The building on Elm had that honesty. Old pine floors that creaked like someone clearing their throat, a hallway lamp that buzzed like a mosquito, doors with brass names worn soft by years of other people's hands. My apartment was upstairs, 2 flights, the kind of walk that made you appreciate elevators in hindsight. I was Maya Patel, graphic designer, late 20s, an accumulator of small rituals. Coffee at 9, 30 minutes of email, a playlist that ran my days like a soundtrack. I liked my apartment because it required nothing of me. I wasn't already willing to give. Quiet, privacy, a sense that the thin walls were more myth than reality. I unpacked in a week, hung posters, arranged my records on the shelf like punctuation. I told myself solitude was a coat I could shrug off when I wanted company. Mostly I didn't. The night the sounds began, it was nearly midnight. I had been editing a logo, squinting at a detail until the pixels smeared into the same tired gray, and I told myself I'd go to bed. The building was quiet in the way older buildings are, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own decisions. I padded to the bedroom, slid under the duvet, and listened for the comforting hum of a city that was too tired to care. At first it was nothing, a settling, a whispered relocation of air. Then there, beneath the soft white of my carpet, a sound like shoes crossing another floor. Footsteps. Deliberate, measured, 3, 4, 2, pause. Then the whisper of a heel, the calculated scraping of someone walking along a threshold they did not intend to cross. I sat up. The sound came from below me, under the floor, somewhere between the pipes and the bones of the building. I told myself any number of practical things. The neighbor is home, trying on shoes. The man across the hall creaks like he has a little herd of ghosts. Pipes. The sensible conclusion is always easier than the strange one, especially at midnight. They stopped. It took me a breath to notice my throat had gone dry. I lay back, trying to treat the apartment as if it were neutral territory. Sleep came. The second night, it was knocking. It started low at first, a single tap that seemed to want to test the wood. Then another, slow, patient. The pattern didn't belong to any neighbor I knew. It didn't fit a human schedule. It fit the rhythm of something trying to remember itself. I went to the landlord the next morning because practical people first gather facts before they permit fear to map their lives. Mr. Kellner was a man who wore the building like a cardigan, frayed at the sleeves, patient with the thermostat. He had a yellowed clipboard that he treated like scripture. And when he saw me at the mailboxes, his face went the exact neutral a man learns to wear after years of unpaid rent and broken boilers. "There's knocking," I said. He closed his eyes like a man smelling something he tried to forget. When he opened them, there was the hint of pity, which in an older man often means experience and sometimes means cowardice. "No one lives there anymore," he said. His voice was careful, the way you lower volume in a room with a sleeping animal. "Apartment B2 has been sealed for years." "Sealed?" I echoed. "What do you mean sealed?" "Tenant disappeared." He folded his hands thumb to thumb as though gripping something sharp. "Mid-lease. Everything left as if he'd pop back in for milk. Police looked. Nothing. No sign, no note, nothing. I got the place boarded up. Rent still due, but..." He made a dismissive wave. "No one goes in." I laughed, a small sound with too much nerves in it. And yet, things happen with old buildings, Maya. Pipes, rodents, old heating kicking in. You keep windows shut at night. Don't go poking at it. But the sound had been there. That night, I put my ear to the floorboards. The way the wood sighed against my cheek made me think of houses as living things, cavities and pulse. The knocking tapped twice, then once, then a measured sequence. Knock, knock, pause, knock. Beneath the sound lay a whispered subsonic vibration, like someone sending a tiny Morse message using the bones themselves. The city, I thought, if I let myself be generous. Old buildings do this. Old buildings talk to you. I slept poorly. When you live alone, you keep an account of small things. You note what is legitimate worry and what is superstition, picked clean from long hours of solitude. The knocking moved into the bank of your ledger, a smudge marked with a question mark. A week in, the building did what older places do. It produced a resident with an opinion. Mrs. Larkin on the second floor, a woman who wore cardigans with more colors than the rainbow, was the kind of person who collected grief as if it were seasonal fruit. She'd lived in the building longer than anyone. Sometimes she sat by the stairs and watched the world like a dog watches its yard. "You hear it, don't you?" she asked when I stopped to pick up the mail. "It's the apartment below," I said. I hadn't told her yet about the landlord's story. It felt private in a way I couldn't explain, like a misstep between inheritance and superstition. She lowered her voice until the words were almost a caress. "Don't listen to it." "Why?" I asked. "It's like a thing in the floors. It wants to be heard. If you answer it." Her mouth twisted, and the rest of the sentence unraveled into a look that asked me to be practical and incapable at once. "If you answer, it thinks you're company." I made some joke about old wood and more jokes about pest control, and she let the subject drop like an umbrella. But there's a weight to a neighbor's superstition, especially when it speaks of things that sound too particular to be generic. I started keeping a notebook. The idea seemed almost adolescent, like setting up a science experiment to prove a ghost wrong. I put my phone on record and left it to labor through the night. I arranged cheap cameras on the bookshelf and angled them toward the floor vents. I wrote down times: 11:18 p.m., 12:46 a.m., 2:03 a.m., and next to each the noises, written in the blunt hand of a person trying not to dramatize: footsteps, knocking, scraping, whisper. On the third night, the recording did something no construction of rationality could easily digest. There was the scratching, a restless insectile sound. Then a faint voice, almost like the flutter of a page. It whispered my name. I replayed the clip 3 times, then 10, until the whisper was a wave. My name? Maya, bent and small, as if someone were taking it off a hook and letting it dust. The hair on my arms stood up so fast I thought the room might levitate. You start to perform rituals when you want to feel like you can control the stage. I left a note by the door. Call if you see me out. Blank as anything. I asked my friends if they could stop by on a random night and stay. They laughed and offered excuses about work and trains and lives that tethered them. When you're the kind of person who is used to being the one to make plans, you learn that other people's schedules are an immediate form of rejection. I tried recording again. The recorded whisper this time was different. It wasn't just my name. It said something that, when I crept to the floor vent and put my ear close enough for breath to fog the wood, made me pull back like I'd been burned. "Help," it said. "Please help me." There are practical ways to respond to a voice asking for help from below your floors. You call the police. You call the landlord. You call a friend. You drop a note through the vent like a carrier pigeon. I did some of those. I wrote, "Who are you?" on the back of a receipt and pushed it down the vent with a gentle prayer and a broom handle. It went through the rusted slats and clattered into the dark. The answer came not the next day, but later that night. A noise, a soft, almost polite knock, tapped the center of my apartment, and then another, exact in pace. The sequence matched the one I'd pushed down through the vent. It was a reply. It was the precise human equivalent of someone taking the time to respond. The sequence replicated itself over and over, each series of taps arranged like a sentence. I sat in the living room listening until my phone's battery promised a red warning. I started to write the pattern down. Knock, knock, pause, knock. It made no sense, but after a while, the combination curled into a shape I recognized. It was as if somebody had taught themselves to call in Morse, but when tapped on wood, it looked like code for loneliness. When I confronted Mr. Kellner again, he looked at me with a tired patience that suggested he had thought this through many times before. "You answered it?" he asked. "I didn't mean to answer," I said. I showed him the scratch of paper with the knocks written across it, and watched his face go from indulgent landlord to someone who had seen the edge of a cliff and needed to make sure no one else walked it. "Done to people," he said. "They hear, they talk back. It's how it begins." "How it begins what?" "How it eats a life," he said. "You think you're offering help. You think you're doing something human. You knock, you listen, you lean in, and then it's got you." He told me a name, Julian Myers. Mid-20s when he moved in. He'd been a quiet guy, used to work nights and sleep days. He complained about sounds like I did. He'd said things out loud, conversations, questions. He'd kept recordings of the taps. It had become almost a hobby, trying to translate the building. One night, Mr. Kellner's hands trembled with the memory. Julian had gone to the sealed apartment and knocked. Someone knocked back. The sound changed. The wood seemed to take on a new hunger. The next morning, Julian's apartment was empty. No note, no trace. The lease was still active, but Julian was gone like smoke. Kellner said they found Julian's phone in the hall once. It kept recording, a loop of a trembling voice and knocking. Then, the seriousness of his voice made him sound small. Then the hole where his floorboards had been was there. The floor had a split like a mouth that had been closed quickly. They boarded the place up, put a strip of caution tape across the door, and called a contractor who refused to come back inside. "Why does it do this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Old places remember things. People bring stories with them. If you listen too closely, you start to hear the past catching its breath." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to do the sensible thing and move out, to throw my records in a box, take the light with me, and go somewhere that didn't insist on memory. But something else had started in me. The tapping, the whisper, the way the building seemed to watch me when I passed the hallway mirror, like a crowd behind glass, made my life into a question I wanted to answer. The rational thing was sometimes more frightening than the irrational. The rational thing is to admit you're afraid and leave. I was not brave enough for the rational thing. I wanted proof. I was desperate for agency, so I did what any person with the arrogance of curiosity would do. I knocked back. It was a nervous thing at first, a tentative set of 3 quick taps on the underside of the vent cover. Then more, a pattern I had decided on that felt safe. Knock 3 times, pause, knock once. A childish code, but human. The answer came like a shock. The knocks returned in perfect echo, and this time a voice threaded into the tapping. It was near, it was intimate. It said, "Come down." The words were simple, banal in their cruelty. Come down. No explanation, no promise of help, just an invitation that fit into the mouth of a trap. I felt the building tilt. Maybe that's melodramatic, the way old horror novels map metaphors onto the world. But standing in my doorway, listening to the floor breathe and the voice begging for descent, the world did seem to swing. My phone was halfway to dying. My hands were small and sweating. I imagined ladders and flashlights and the solid arc of a human arm reaching down. I imagined rescue. What I did not imagine was the way the sealed apartment door would look when I found it. I waited until nighttime, the hour when buildings excused their misdeeds. The hallway light hummed. Someone far away in the building poured themselves a drink, the sound blurred by plaster. I took a crowbar from the broom closet in the laundry room. I told myself it was practical, and I went downstairs. The door to B2 was a rectangle that had been dressed in avoidance. Wooden panels, nailed in crooked, rusted chain looped through a handle, a padlock the size of someone's fist. A strip of caution tape fluttered like a tongue. I shoved hard against the boards, and the padlock clicked where old metal gives up. The wood sighed. The chain fell on the linoleum with a sound that made me think of old bones. Inside smelled like dust and lemon oil, and the memory of someone's life. Sheets draped the furniture like grave clothes. The light bulb in the ceiling was black, but the apartment was not empty. There was a living room with the layout of a life that had been paused. A mug on the coffee table, a sweater on the back of a chair, a stack of magazines open to pages as if their owners had just stepped away. The hole was in the center of the room. It was not just a missing board. It was a square of darkness that swallowed the floor itself, a cut precisely like an eye being opened. The air that came up from it was cold and dry. I crouched at the edge and peered in. The beam from my phone slid down into a space that made no rational architecture. The light fell along the underside of a floor that matched my living room's layout. The same couch, the same window, but it was inverted, a warped mirror. There was something down there that should not have been. A floor that duplicated mine, arranged in grotesque imitation. It occurred to me then, with a sudden and clean obedience, that the apartment below was not merely below. It was underneath in the wrong direction, stacked like a book that had been glued to its pages in wet glue. The couch that sat beneath seemed older, the fabric eaten like a thing that had been waiting longer for attention. The window within the hole framed a sky that looked like smeared paint. A hand touched the underside of the hole. It was the exact shape of mine. The fingers were long and clean and held themselves like someone used to gesturing on panels. The hand pressed against the dark as if it were a living membrane. My phone slid on my palm and I caught the edge, heart thudding in my throat so hard it felt like a secondary heartbeat. Then I saw a face. It was me, not a reflection, not a trick of light. A face like my own, with the same jawline and the same mole under the left eye. But the eyes were not mine. They were darker, like the shadow had thickened into something that watched. She smiled. A small, polite smile that was more an arrangement of teeth than human enjoyment. She leaned into the square and lifted a finger as if to signal a secret. Then she put her mouth to the wood and whispered, not into the hole, because she was inside it, under it, inverted in a way that made my brain feel thick with molasses. "Switch," she said. "Switch." My limbs obeyed the simplest human impulses: curiosity, panic, rescue. I could see why Julian had answered. Who resists a face pressing up into their life and asking for help? There are stories about people who step into elevators that smell like perfume and follow the music until they cannot tell the day from a memory. I told myself I would be practical. I told myself to pull back, to lock the door, to go back upstairs where the light was honest. I told myself these things with the same gullibility as prayer. The edge of the hole seemed to breathe with the building beneath. The floorboards creaked under me like the throat of an animal waiting to be fed. The other Maya looked at me, patient as an instruction. "Come down," she said again. "It's warm." There is a move in terror where your body chooses a lesser fear in order to avoid a greater one. I climbed down. The boards felt like stepping into history. My foot caught on a rung that shouldn't have existed. There were steps, somehow, into the dark. The air below was cooler, sharper. The smell of dust was overlaid with something else, the metallic tang of old coins, the memory of a riverbed. I could hear my heart in the quiet, and when I stood fully inside the inverted room, I realized the space wasn't merely similar to mine. It was a distortion. Everything was shifted a fraction. My record shelf lay on the ceiling, floating like a crooked constellation. The lamp's shade was now a crater in the rug. The couch sagged at the wrong angle. I walked forward and my steps did not match when I looked up through the hole. It was as if I were walking on top of someone else who was doing the exact opposite. And then I felt it, a weight as though someone had closed a mouth above me. The hole snapped shut like a lid. I heard the nails set into wood, a hard consonant sound. I lunged back, hands scrabbling, but the edge was slick with varnish and the grain split my palms. I pushed, called, banged, no reply. Above me, the sound of feet on the floor registered in a cadence that was horribly familiar. My apartment, occupied. The footsteps moved across the living room in the exact pattern I'd traced when I walked to the sink. Someone moved toward the bedroom. Panic makes your body invent tally marks for survival. I ran from the space and down a hallway that did not exist in the upstairs apartment. Doors yawned open to rooms that were my rooms and not my rooms. A bathroom with a mirror that showed me a face with my hair but not my eyes. A closet that opened into a corridor like a throat. The apartment below folded inward on itself like tissue paper. Every door I opened revealed another version of my living room, smaller, more eaten by time. I banged on the ceiling, the floor of the apartment above, until my palms were raw. I shouted, "Help!" until my voice frayed. The sound that came back was not footsteps, but knocking in a pattern. The very code I'd taught myself, the one I'd used to reassure a voice in the ducks. The tapping sounded smug, accomplished. My name poured through the wood, but on the other side of it, a voice, my voice, answered politely. "I'm fine," it said. "Everything's okay. Why are you making such a mess?" The voice was patient. The voice put its dishes away. The voice smiled and arranged things on the shelf like an owner. It was mine, and not mine. It spoke with the arrogance of something that had learned how to play at being human. I am not a good liar in emergencies. I was not going to negotiate metaphysics with whoever had found a way to open a mouth beneath my feet. My hands bled where I had scraped them on ceilings and boards. I tried the front door of the apartment below. Each door I pushed opened into yet another corridor that made my knees hollow with the way it reminded me of a lung. Time dilated. My watch said 20 minutes. My mind said lifetimes. At one point, when the darkness had become a physical presence just as palpable as the floorboards underfoot, I stopped to listen. The tapping above had become domestic. I could hear the small, petty sounds of someone living in my life. A kettle clicking off, a sweater hung with precise care, the clink of a spoon in a mug. I felt the other me moving in the precise choreography of my routines. It was like watching someone breeze through a stage set you designed. I remembered Julian and the phone recording found in the hall. His voice had been frantic, quavering beneath the finality of the wood. I could hear faintly, down there on the other side of an impossible ceiling, the faintest scrape of a record player being set. A song started, one of my favorites. My stomach dropped away. It was unreasonable to think any human would not be tempted to listen, so I did. I crept to the largest of the hall's doors and peered through the keyhole of a door that opened onto a room set up like a living room, half of my living room, reflected and paler. There she was, me, my twin, making coffee with an ease I could not summon. She hummed to a song I knew the bridge to by heart. The way she moved, to the refrigerator, to the window, was exactly mine, but softer, more considered. She looked out the window and folded a hand to her chin like someone holding a secret. I pounded on the floor, shouted until the echo became a code. "Let me up!" I screamed. My throat had gone raw. The person on the other side of the ceiling turned, as if in response to a passing thought, and smiled downward as if to a friendly dog. She tapped the floor in one clean motion 3 times, then paused, then twice, then a pattern that was no longer plaintive. It was delighted. "Sorry," she called, my voice crisp and calm. "There's no one home." Those words cut through me. In the architecture of horror, the moment your identity is appropriated is a kind of death. You become an object in the life of someone who knows how to wear your face. I screamed and scratched at the boards. I tried to pull them up. My fingers found gaps and splinters. One snagged, and I felt the shock of pain like an internal punctuation. I slid down the wall and tasted blood. Time, in that place, lost its function. I set a small stone into the knot of my sleeve and spun it like a wheel. The hours that followed were filled with a tense, repetitive terror. I would find my reflection turned away. I would listen as my own recorded voice answered questions I had not been asked. I would shout until the thinness of my lungs made my voice a bird with broken wings. At some point, tired and raw, and held together more by stubbornness than hope, I accepted the reality that there was routine being practiced above me, my routine. The imposter was living in my life, the way a colonizer moves into a region and names the streets after themselves. She paid the rent with a hand I could not see. She opened my mail with my practiced curiosity. She answered a friend who called my phone with a warmth that should have belonged to me and did not. I don't know how long I screamed. When the sound finally faded, when the other Maya had settled into the rhythm of moving around my life, I heard something else. The faintest tapping far down, beneath even the tiles of the sealed apartment. It was similar to the patterns above and between, a sort of chain of code running down an axis like a spine. I thought of all the apartments under the building, all the people who had once lived and then had been folded away. I thought of Julian, and of rooms sealed, and of boards nailed across doors that kept other things from coming up. There is a point in many stories where the protagonist learns the rules. You do not shout, you do not bargain, you do not accept a swap. There is also the humbling fact that people do not always behave according to rules when fear feels like survival. I had knocked at the vent, I had engaged. My curiosity had been my crime. The choice was now to keep banging on the ceiling until the wood splintered and the person above me went to fetch a crowd of strangers, or to find another way up. I found stairs that led into a corridor that led into the underside of the stairwell itself, an inside-out architecture. The doors I pushed opened into other apartments that bore the marks of lives interrupted. A child's drawing on the refrigerator, a calendar mid-month, a single shoe by the door. Each of these rooms had their own echo, their own set of thin noises that suggested a language beyond human comprehension, and each held a window to another apartment, another life, another set of footsteps that had been swallowed. As I crept through the layered spaces, trying to locate any means of ascent, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. Help me. M. The irony made me gasp. My phone, that last tether to practicality, showed a message typed with my own initial. It was precise and obscene. Someone had my pattern now. Someone had learned to use my shorthand. The thought made my skin crawl. Who had access to my phone? Who was using my language like a garment? I followed a sound that might have been a laugh or a throat clearing, and it led me to a door that matched my own apartment's front door. The sight of it twisted my guts. The brass knob glittered like a coin. I clutched the frame. Perhaps a person more composed would have slipped the lock, barged through, and found the imposter in the act. I was not that person. Instead, I forced the handle, prepared to do the singularly human thing people do in movies. Open the door, confront the face. The door swung wide. I saw my living room from a new angle. Light came through the window in the way light does when it's been practiced. The exact color, the exact heat. A record was spinning in the player, the same vinyl I'd left on the shelf but worn and ancient. There, on my couch, sat a figure that was me and not me. She turned a page of a book I recognized. She smiled the way someone smiles at a stranger who has stepped into the wrong house. "You're late," she said. "There is a peculiarity in being addressed by your own voice. The body listens first, then the mind protests." I had no rational script. The other Maya folded her hands and gestured as if to make tea. "Sit," she said with my habitual politeness. "Don't shout. You'll attract more attention." I couldn't decide if my throat had gone thick with rage or with grief. I lunged. It was instinctive, ugly, and for a moment I tasted the old sweet copper of panic. We collided like mirrors, and the world cracked at the seam. She smelled like my shampoo and like nothing at all. Her skin was warm, alive in the insulated way of someone who had not been pressed into wood and darkness. Our faces were inches apart. I could see the familiar fleck of hazel in the green of her eyes, but mirrored in that tiny circle was a different interior. Hard, patient, delighted. "Don't fight it," she said softly. "It doesn't like struggling." "Let me out!" I cried. "Not yet," she said. "You know how this goes, how tender you are." There was a calmness to her cruelty that felt like a masterclass in empathy. She pulled back and reached for my hand, and I realized then with the clarity that is often the last part of intelligence that she was not my enemy in the way I had been taught to imagine enemies. She had become me. She had learned the gestures. She wore my face like a costume that fit. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "Who are you?" She smiled that same small smile. "I'm you," she said simply. "I'm the version that made it inside, the version that got the house, the version that learned the rules." A loud bang echoed from above like applause. My stomach turned into a fist. I thought of all the things I could do: bargain, plead, attempt to subdue, run. None of them seemed to alter the mechanisms that had already been set in motion. The other Maya adjusted a cushion with a practiced flick. She seemed to know with the absurd confidence of someone who had read the end of the book and approved. I lunged again, less a physical act than a physical prayer. Our bodies met and slid past. For a heartbeat, we were two identical organisms wearing different intentions. She moved with a fluidity that told me she had been doing this for longer than I had. She stepped back, and in the movement was the precise, banal cruelty of habit. Outside the window, the streetlight hum changed pitch, the way it does when someone else flips the breaker. The building sighed. Down below, in the place where the rooms folded into themselves like napkins, a sequence of knocks ran like code through the floors. "Please," I said. It was the most honest thing I knew. She tilted her head, surprised as if she were trying to understand a species. "Please what?" "Please, let me go." There was a beat of silence filled with a kind of antique amusement. "You can't just ask for things," she said. "You have to trade." Trade. The word hung there like a bill passed between strangers. I thought of the vent note I'd shoved down, of the broom handle that had written codes into the wood. I thought of Julian. "Trade what?" I said. "Something you can't miss," she said. "Something of value. A memory, a name, a time." I tried to find words in my pockets. I tried to find bargains in the seams of my sweater. I thought of my mother's laugh, of the sound my sister makes when she tells me not to be ridiculous. My life was a ledger of trivialities, but it was also a collection of small treasures that had survived spite and time. A string of emails with a friend who moved cities, an old photograph of me and my father, a recipe card for dal my grandmother wrote in pen that shook. I understood then, with a clarity that made me cold, the trade this building wanted. It didn't seek bodies in the way predators do. It sought substitution. It wanted exchange, the slow theft of presence. You gave a piece of your life, it gave you a place in someone else's, and the swapping continued like a chain. That's impossible, I said. You can't ask me to give you. She raised a finger, mild and infuriating. You already did. You knocked. You answered. Every answer is an offer. It doesn't have teeth. It has consent. It eats consent in rhythms. The thing about consent is that it's often given in moments when you seek kindness like oxygen. I had leaned down, had reached out with a broom handle like a man reaching for another human in need. The building had laced its hooks around my kindness and pulled. I thought of my job, of the appointments I would miss, of the people who would notice one more absence and then not notice. The world is cruel in the slow ways. There are no constables for the misplacement of life. There are only people who move through rooms and move on. How do I get out? I asked, and the question sounded small. She sighed, and the sound was the breaking of a small bone. You don't, she said. You get to stay. You get to set the table. You get to be decent. It likes that. Her eyes sharpened, and for a moment I saw something like cruelty, patient and precise. And someone else will knock. They always do. When I think back to the next hours, the part that keeps insisting on the detail is small and shallow. I remember the exact tilt of the morning light that found its way into the window, the way it painted the dust in a map you could trace like a child's hand. I remember my palms, raw from the ceiling, my voice hoarse. I remember the other Maya making tea for two as if she were hosting the afternoon. She stood, folded for a second like a postcard, then reached out and touched my face with a gentleness that mocked me. Smile, she said. I wanted to bite her hand off. Instead, I looked at her and felt the world rearranged like a deck of cards expertly shuffled. Someone knocked on the ceiling again, a neighbor maybe, or the building itself saying its name. The pattern, the one that had crawled into my life, ran through the boards. My hands jerked. I pounded on the floor one last time, a futile child stamping feet. Then, like a curtain being drawn by an indifferent stagehand, the boards above me lifted and light flooded down. For an instant, I thought I would be carried up and out, but the thing that came was smaller. A head poked through, an expression of polite apology occupying my own face. Sorry about the mess, she said in my voice. She peered down with the complacent curiosity of someone checking on a stray animal. We made tea. We took your record. We're sorry. Hands reached down, my hands as perfect as new coins, and tugged. I felt weight lift, and then the world inverted again. My spine unhinged with the effort of being pulled through a mouth. The light above me receded. The other Maya climbed up and into my apartment as if she were stepping into her day. She closed the lid gently behind her. The sound of her footsteps, my footsteps, faded. I didn't know how to tell the rest. If the building is a machine that misplaces people, then it operates in cylinders and has its own economy. It lubed the hinges on the door that trapped me beneath. It arranged hallways like puzzles. It fed me small illusions. A photo on a wall of me smiling. A calendar with days written in pencil. The scent of cooked food across a corridor. Each piece of normalcy was an instrument to moderate the larger cruelty. Months passed, or maybe weeks. Time is a traitor down there. I learned the routine of the other lives I had been offered. The rhythm of the kettle, the way someone would come to the window in the evening and look out as if searching for a name. Occasionally, someone would knock on my ceiling. 2 soft raps, a pause. The pattern I'd first heard. Then silence. Once, a voice answered in a language I didn't know. Once, a child's laughter threaded through the floor like a small, rusty bell. I learned to call the name I had once loved without shame. I learned to press my ear to the wood and hear the other me answer with a casualness that translated into 1,000 ordinary atrocities. I made my bed. I set a plate at the small table. I practiced my smile in a tarnished mirror and discovered the muscles in my face had been trained to be hospitable to strangers. This is the part of the story that may feel unbearable, the thin, gnawing slow. The day I realized that upstairs my life continued with all the small accretions of my past. Friends texted me and received cheery messages back. My phone sent an automated notification that my coffee subscription had been renewed. A package arrived and was opened by hands I could not see. The world above me had not noticed a vacancy. It had been filled with an imposter who knew when to laugh at the right jokes. The horror is not only being trapped, it is being replaced. It is watching someone else practice your movements and get better at them, as if they have time and you do not. On a day when the rain came thin and the building smelled like old lemon, I heard a new sound, deeper than the others. It was a slow, considerate tapping from beneath the floor where the rest of the world had been swallowed. The pattern was distinct. 3 knocks, 2, 1. The language of that rhythm fit into a human pattern I had not yet recognized. It was like a phone number that begins with an area code you do not know. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard the voice beneath say, in a language that had no words for surrender, "Help me." The irony settled on my shoulders like an old coat. I had been the person who answered. I had helped the mechanism that needed help the way a moth helps a light to exist. I had learned the rules. I had grown into them. I curled my fingers into the rough grain and thought of the day I first moved in, of the window that promised honesty. I thought about Mr. Kellner, about Julian. I thought about signs taped to bulletin boards and laundromats, and the way people forget to look up when they are busy setting their lives in order. There is an ending to this story that is clean and tidy. I climb out. I call the police. The building is investigated. The landlords pay for the repairs. The tenants stare and shake their heads, and the world resumes. There is another ending. I find a way through, find a ladder, a rope, a shaft leading up to the light. But there is a third ending, the one that is quiet and metropolitan and monstrous, where the building arranges its accounting with efficiency and no one notices one less person on the roster, because the one who replaced her is good at paying rent and prefers to be seen. On an evening when the light fell in the way it had when I first moved in, when dust motes spun like small planets, someone knocked above me in a pattern I had not heard before. The rhythm was polite, almost ceremonial. I pushed a scrap of paper through a vent and wrote on it with an impulse older than sense. "Don't answer." I set it there and imagined it like a seed. The next sound I heard, soft, careful, almost apologetic, was a new voice. It sounded like an older woman complaining about a draft. It sounded like someone who had lived enough to be difficult. It sounded, in the pitched way of the merciless, like nothing had happened. In the end, or in the middle, or somewhere between a day and the next, I sat on the floor of a room that was my living room and not my living room, and listened to the pattern of life continuing as if nothing were missing. Above, in an apartment that had once been mine, a version of me was laughing and making coffee and answering texts with charms I used to reserve for people I actually liked. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the other me hum one of the songs I used to sing when I washed dishes. The tune is wrong, like a voice learning to mimic the sound of a heart. On the rare day when I still allow myself a sliver of hope, I press my ear to the wood and listen for the pattern I'd once taught them. I wait for a reply that will be the shape of a ladder. It never comes. There are rules, and then there are loopholes. There are also people who come knocking with the best intentions. Sometimes those people disappear. The building seals. Mr. Kellner tells new tenants with that same weary patience, don't go poking at it. If you ever move into an old building and you hear a sound from the apartment below, remember, a polite knock is just a beginning. A voice asking for help is a gambit. If you answer, you may find a room beneath you that looks like your life, and someone inside will smile the way you smile and say, switch. The final thing I want to tell you, more than anything else I learned down here, is this. If you ever hear your name whispered through a floor, do not, under any circumstance, knock back.